The next hours passed in a blur. Snow White ran through the trees, fleeing from shadow to shadow as the forest transformed into ghosts from her nightmares. Finally, she calmed enough to realize that her fears were making things seem more frightening than they actually were. It was then that the forest animals approached her and led her to a cottage in the woods. What followed was one of the strangest yet most wondrous evenings she'd ever experienced. The house belonged to 7 kind little men. Not only did they welcome her into their house for dinner, but they agreed to let her stay with them. They even volunteered to sleep downstairs so that she could have the upstairs bedroom to herself. She was grateful to have found the kind men. The next morning, she awoke feeling fresher and braver. She came downstairs and cooked a big breakfast, then stood by the door to see her new hosts off as they left for work. "Have a good day, Grumpy," she said. "I'll have a gooseberry pie ready for you this evening." Grumpy attempted a scowl, but Snow White could see the smile trying to sneak out. She was starting to realize he was not nearly as bad-tempered as he pretended to be. Doc dotted his hat, solicitous as usual. "Now, Princess, be careful," he said. "The Queen is a tricky one." "I know," said Snow White. "Don't you worry. I'll be just fine." In the clear light of morning, she could almost believe it. After her new friends left, the forest animals gathered around her. Dottie and several blue jay friends perched on the windowsill. 2 deer peeked in through the doorway. A family of rabbits sat around the fireplace, and 2 squirrels sprawled on top the dining table. Snow White inhaled. She wished she could revel in this cozy home, but she still had that uneasy feeling that she was not quite free from the Queen's wrath. "Well, there's no reason to tarry," she said, clapping her hands. "Let's get the washing and cooking done, and then I have some spells to practice." She delegated the dishes to the rabbits and the sweeping to the squirrels, then instructed the birds to forage for berries. The only task she didn't trust the animals to do properly was the baking, so she rolled out dough and assembled the gooseberry pie herself. When everything was clean and the pie was sat ready to bake, she collapsed into a chair, giving herself a few moments to sip a cup of tea. "Shall I try some spells?" she asked after a while. The fawns shied away, but the rabbits jumped and twitched their ears. Snow White took out her bag and laid its contents on the table. Flowers that she'd picked at the meadow, the spells she'd cut from the Queen's book, and the magic mirror still ominously dark. Snow White's gut clutched at the sight of the mirror. Perhaps if she became better at magic, she'd be able to fix it. She spread the parchments in front of her. "What do you suppose a life-giving spell does?" Healing magic would certainly come in useful. The spell itself looked similar in form to the shrinking charm, with an incantation and accompanying hand gestures. It took Snow less time to learn this spell than it taken to learn the shrinking charm. She was starting to get a feel for magic done right, the warmth and the gathering of power that told her she was on the right path. On her 4th try, she felt the familiar surge working toward her fingertips, and she pointed at a cut wildflower. A spark of light leapt from her finger to the flower, spreading from the leaf where it landed to the very edges of the flower's petals. Then a new green shoot grew out of the stem. One of the deer nibbled at it. "Oh, you don't want to eat that," said Snow White, but the creature just wagged her tail. "Well, the spell seems to work," Snow White went on, placing another cut flower at the center of the table. "Let me try it again." Snow White repeated the incantation. The power gathered in her hands. The deer belched. Snow White jumped. The spell shot out at an angle and hit the magic mirror. For a moment, the glass glowed brilliantly, and then it went dark. Snow White grabbed the mirror and looked over its surface in panic. Had she broken it? No cracks or noticeable damage, and the surface was... Snow White stared. Images flickered across the glass and disappeared again. There was Snow White as a little girl, playing with her father. Snow White older and mourning her father's passing. Then more recent images of her fleeing the hunter. Was the mirror regaining its magic? But as she watched, the pictures faded away. A prickle of possibility ran through her. Maybe the life-giving spell could bring the mirror back to life. Snow White drew a deep breath and placed it back on the table. As carefully as she could, she spoke the spell again and directed it straight at the mirror. Once again, the mirror glowed. Once again, images of the past flitted across it, but they were short-lived. Snow White cast the life-giving spell on the mirror 5 more times. Each time, the images appeared briefly before disappearing. Was the mirror getting better with each successive casting? As much as she wished it to be true, it didn't seem so. Snow White sat back in her chair. Repeating a failed spell over and over again didn't seem wise. Maybe it would be better to move on to the shield incantation. This spell required a mirror, and of course, Snow White had one in front of her, albeit a rather extraordinary one. It felt wrong to use what had once been such a powerful artifact as a magical prop, but she didn't have any other options. Snow White read carefully through the steps. It was complicated, requiring not just incantations, but weaving a garland of flowers around the edge of the mirror. Snow White grabbed 2 of the blue wildflowers, knotted their stems together, and started to braid. The work reminded her a bit of crocheting without the hooks. After a while, she fell into a rhythm. Her fingers started to smell like perfume. She was brought out of her concentration by the sun striking her eyes through the front window. She turned her chair and kept weaving. Just a few more knots to go. Finally, Snow White put down her handwork and admired it. It was a bit messy, but it looked pretty close to the picture. The birds flew in to look. "Do you like it?" The birds tweeted their approval. Snow White held up the braid again, but then she looked closer. Wait, that wasn't right. Somehow, she'd woven a pattern that was the mirror image of the one on the parchment. Oh. The dismay must have come clearly through her voice, because the family of rabbits nuzzled her ankles. Snow White rubbed her temples. Her eyes were tired from such close work, and her fingers ached. Her 7 hosts would probably be coming home soon. Perhaps it'd be better to start again tomorrow. The sparrows and blue jays helped her clear the table of fallen petals, and Snow White carefully stowed the mirror and parchments in the cupboard. All alone, my pet? The little men are not here? Snow White jumped. An old woman peeked in over the open top half of the cottage door. As Snow White's heartbeat slowed, she saw that the woman was frail, wrinkled, and stooped. On her arm, she carried a basket of apples. Snow White felt a surge of compassion for her. It must be a hard life to be so old and to still have to wander the land selling wares. "They aren't here," she answered. "Do you know them?" The peddler woman sniffed the air. "Making pies?" The woman certainly was odd. Snow White wondered if she was hard of hearing. "Yes, gooseberry pies. It's apple pies that make the men folks' mouths water. Pies made from apples like these." Would you like to try one? The crone held up a perfectly smooth red apple. Snow White could smell its fragrance from across the room. Oh, they do look delicious. Go on, said the peddler woman. Have a bite. There was a flutter of wings. The birds flocked around the peddler's woman's head, pecking at her and pulling at her cloak. The woman cried out. Stop it! Stop it! Snow White shouted over the confusion. Go away! Shame on you, frightening an old lady. The peddler woman covered her face with her arms as Snow White escorted her inside and sat her down at the table. She didn't know what had gotten into the birds. Snow White had never seen them give anyone a stern look, much less attack. Sit down, madam, she said. I'm so sorry. I'll bring you some tea for your nerves. And would you like some cake? That would be lovely, dearie. Something about the old woman's smile made Snow White uneasy. Or was it simply the animal's strange behavior getting to her? There were 2 slices of leftover cake. Snow White walked to the cupboard where she'd stored them next to the flower-wreathing magic mirror. Sneaking a glance at the old woman, Snow White angled her body so the woman wouldn't see. Speaking under her breath, she cast a life-giving spell at the mirror and then angled the reflective surface over her shoulder. The image came instantly. Snow White biting into an apple, then falling lifeless to the ground. The old woman cackling and turning into her stepmother. Snow White swallowed a cry and hurried to put the mirror down before she dropped it. The images the mirror had shown her before had been of the past, but this one seemed to be a warning. How had the queen found her so soon? Snow White quelled the overwhelming urge to flee. As weak as the peddler woman looked, Snow White wasn't sure she'd be able to outrun her. It took everything she had to force a smile onto her face. Then she picked up the cake and brought it to the table. It's not as good as it is fresh out of the oven, but I hope you like it, she said shakily. The old woman smiled again. Now that Snow White knew what to look for, she could see her stepmother's smirk, that bit of ice beneath the unfamiliar face. It's delicious, dearie. Let me repay you with this apple. She once again held out that luscious fruit. Even though Snow White had seen the truth of what it was, her mouth watered. Thank you, she said. I'm not hungry now, but I will keep it for later. You must have a bite now. The old woman leaned in conspiratorially. I'll share a secret with you. This is a magic wishing apple. One bite and all your dreams will come true. There must be something your little heart desires. Snow White looked around for the animals. A few sparrows peered in from the window, and 3 chipmunks crowded near the door. But the rest were gone. Perhaps there's someone you love? Asked the queen. Come now, a lovely maid like you simply must have a bite. It was hard to think with the peddler woman pushing the apple so insistently. She was going to get suspicious if Snow White kept refusing. Maybe there was some way of convincing her that her ploy was working. Gingerly, Snow White took the apple. Maybe just a bite, she said. She put it to her mouth, turning away so the queen couldn't see that it didn't touch her lips. Even so, the apple's fragrance filled her nose, tempting her to have just one taste. Snow White mimed eating it. Then she made herself go limp, just as she'd seen in the mirror. She slid off the chair and let the apple roll out of her hand. Had that been convincing enough? Snow White kept her breathing as shallow as possible as footsteps came nearer, paused next to her, and then headed away. The door opened and closed. She counted to 100 before finally opening her eyes. Sunlight streamed in through the windows. Everything was quiet. The apple lay undisturbed, several paces away. Slowly she pushed herself up and walked to the door. Where were the animals? "You're cleverer than I thought," said the old woman from behind her. Snow White turned. There was the crone next to the stairway. The old woman stood straighter now. The stoop was gone from her back. Step by resolute step, her stepmother closed the distance between them. "I used to think you were useless and stupid, but you've escaped death twice now. Perhaps I've underestimated you." Snow White should have known right away that something wasn't right. It had been too quiet. Her animals had not come to her. The queen continued her slow advance. "Maybe my mistake was not wanting to get my hands dirty. Perhaps the basest methods are still the most effective." She reached a wrinkled hand into the folds of her cloak and drew out a long knife. Then, with a speed that did not belong to any elderly woman, she ran at Snow White. A cacophony of bird calls, a blue and brown cloud streamed through the windows, straight at the old woman's face. The queen screeched and slashed her knife at the sparrows and blue jays. The birds scattered, and Snow White's heart seized when she saw that one sparrow had fallen to the ground. "No!" The sight of that limp body spurred her to action. She cast the life-giving spell at the fallen bird, but her aim was off. The spell hit the gooseberry pie, which immediately sprouted legs and walked off the table. The queen stared at the pie. "Where did you learn that?" 3 rabbits rushed through the door and crowded around the queen's feet as a fawn tugged at her cloak. Snow White cast another life-giving spell at the fallen sparrow and went soft with relief when the bird shook itself and hopped onto its feet. There was another storm of wings. The rest of the birds surrounded Snow White and pulled her toward the door. As they fled, Snow White heard the queen chanting the life-giving spell. Was she healing herself? But the queen hadn't been hurt. Had she? It didn't feel right. Snow White dropped behind a water trough just as a bolt of light sailed overhead and struck a tree, which immediately shriveled. That had been no life-giving spell. The words had been the same, but the queen had spoken them in reverse. A killing spell. "There's no use hiding," the queen said. "I'll admit, I'm impressed you picked up some magic, but I know a fledgling caster when I see one. Come out, and no more of your animal friends get hurt." The queen's voice dropped as she started chanting a new spell. Snow White peeked around the water trough to see her stepping outside. Overhead, Snow White saw the birds gather to fly at the queen again. "No!" she shouted. "Save yourselves!" She should have worked harder at her magic. It seemed so foolish that she had thought she could protect herself with walking pies when the queen had missiles that killed on contact. Could she flip the life-giving spell again? Or herself? She racked her brain, trying to visualize the hand gestures in backward order. But a burst of magic exploded on the grass next to her, and her mind went blank. It's no use. She might have been able to flip the spell given a quiet hour to practice, but figuring it out right then was impossible. Though she did have practice with the backward shrinking charm, Snow White pointed at a pebble between herself and the queen, turning it into a boulder as her stepmother neared. As Snow White darted farther away, the queen spoke, and the boulder exploded into hundreds of jagged pieces. Snow White covered her head with her arms as sharp rocks pummeled her skin. So much for that idea. What she really needed was a shield, but she'd gone and braided those flowers backward. Backward. A germ of an idea formed in her mind. She had no idea if it would work, but she was out of options. Snow White heard chattering behind her and turned to see one of the squirrels. "Can you distract the queen so I can run inside?" Snow White asked. The squirrel sprinted toward the queen, circling her and then biting her leg before scampering off. As the queen screamed and gave chase, Snow White made for the cottage door, ducking inside and throwing open the cabinet. There was the magic mirror again, still nestled in its backward braided nest. It was useless as a shield, but perhaps... Footsteps sounded behind her. The queen stepped through the door, knife in hand. "So it was you who took my mirror." Snow White turned to face her stepmother. "Why do you hate me so much?" "It was your beauty that first irked me, but now I see you're a threat in other ways." The queen advanced toward her. Snow White backed against the far wall, clutching the mirror in one hand and the spell page in the other. She began to chant, starting with the last word and working shakily forward. As the queen raised her knife, Snow White ducked and held up the mirror. The birds screamed. Snow White finished the incantation. There was a blinding flash, and then silence. Snow White blinked the after-image of light from her eyes. Everything was so quiet that she wondered if she'd lost her hearing. Cautiously, she looked around. A sparrow limped across the floor with one wing dragging. A squirrel crawled up to nuzzle it. The queen was nowhere in sight. The mirror lay on the floor a few paces away. Its surface looked cloudy. Snow White peered into it, only to spring back at the sight of the queen's face. Her real face, not that of the crone who'd been hunting her. She was surrounded by thick mist, and she was banging on the glass. As Snow White stared in horror, the queen's eyes fixed on her, and her features contorted into a snarl. Snow White shrank away and wondered how she could ever have thought this woman beautiful. "A shield spell is meant to keep things out," she whispered. Spoken backwards, it becomes something to lock things in. Carefully, Snow White took the magic mirror, wrapped it in cloth, and then slipped it into her bag. Leagues away, her castle stood empty, and her country awaited a ruler. "Come," she said to the birds around her, "let's get dinner ready, and then it will be time to go home." And that's the end of Cast Out. I hope you enjoyed this nice little what-if short story here. See you next time.